Aisha Fairwood tugged at her hand-me-down jacket, doing it over and over as she strolled the halls of Crestwood Academy. It was comfy, sure, but worn, and she knew it didn't measure up to the brand-name clothes that seemed to sail through these hallways like ships. Her auburn hair hung down in thick strands around her face, hiding features that could have been pretty if she'd ever looked up. She was slender, almost frail, all sharp bones and careful steps, like she was scared to take up too much space. The early light filtered through the big panes of the main corridor, making long shadows that Aisha tried to keep to as she went to her first class. She'd been at Crestwood for nearly half a year, ever since her dad started working at the local garage, and she still felt like an outsider looking in. The other kids walked around her like she wasn't there, which was just how she liked it. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," said a voice that made Aisha's chest tighten up. She didn't have to see who it was to know it was Bradley Carter, the big man on campus at Crestwood, star athlete, top student, and the kind of guy who acted like he'd always known how things worked in his favor. He had a way of being casually mean that only came from someone who'd never faced any real problems. Aisha kept walking, her old boots quiet on the shiny floor. She'd learned that ignoring him was the best way to deal with him, even if it never really worked out that way. Bradley was always with his friends, Brittany Hayes, whose dad owned most of the businesses around town, and Kyle Jackman, who was almost as strong as Bradley but twice as nasty. They were the kind of kids who ruled the school like they knew they'd always be in charge. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Bradley called out, his voice louder now. Some students started to stop, sensing that something was about to happen. Aisha could feel their eyes on her, some curious, some glad it wasn't them. She stopped at her locker, her hands shaking a little as she tried to open it. The metal door opened, and she pretended to look for a book, hoping they'd just go away. But Bradley had that look in his eyes, like he was bored and wanted to stir things up. "That's quite the get-up," Brittany said, her voice full of fake sweetness. "Very, original. Is that old? Like, really old?" The other students laughed, and Aisha felt her face get hot. She'd tried to make the outfit look good, putting the jacket with a plain blue dress and her only good shoes. It wasn't much, but it was hers. "Leave her be," said a soft voice from behind them. Aisha turned to see Connor Ellis, a guy from her history class who always sat in the back and drew in a notebook. He was thin and tall, with smart eyes behind metal glasses. He'd been nice to her since she came to Crestwood, letting her borrow pens and sharing his notes when she missed class. "Oh, look," Kyle said, smiling. "The nerd squad is getting together." He took a step toward Connor, who stood his ground even though he was smaller than him. "Got something to say, Brainiac?" Connor's face got tight. "I said leave her be." This was just what Aisha had been afraid of. She didn't want anyone getting hurt because of her. "It's okay," she said fast, closing her locker. "I was just leaving anyway." But Bradley stood in her way, his gray eyes hard. "Actually, I don't think you were. I think you were going to tell us about your style. See, Brittany here is always looking for new ideas, and she's fascinated by your look." More students were gathering around them, taking out their phones like magic. Aisha felt stuck, like a rabbit caught in a trap. She knew what would happen next, the mean jokes, the laughter, the way everyone would look at her all day. She'd been through it before at her old school, and she'd hoped things would be different here. What none of them knew was that Aisha had spent the last 5 years in a totally different world. Every Wednesday and Friday night, while other kids were at home watching TV or hanging out, she was at Master Lee's studio downtown, learning Taekwondo. Her mum had signed her up after something bad happened at her last school, thinking it might help her feel better about herself. Instead, it had become Aisha's safe place, where she felt strong and in charge. Master Lee had taught her that real strength wasn't about hurting people. It was about keeping yourself and others safe when you had no other choice. He'd told her over and over that fighting was always the last thing you should do, and that the best fight was the one you didn't have to have. Aisha had taken those words to heart, even when she really wanted to use what she knew. "You know what I think," Bradley said, reaching out to touch her jacket. "I think you're trying too hard to be something you're not. This whole mysterious, quiet girl thing, it's not working for you." Aisha backed away, but she had nowhere to go. The lockers were behind her, and the crowd was pushing in from all sides. She could feel her heart beating fast, the rush of energy that came before a fight, but she made herself stay calm, to breathe like Master Li had taught her. "Just leave me alone," she said, her voice barely loud enough to hear. "What was that?" Kyle made a show of listening. "I didn't hear you." "Did you guys hear anything?" The crowd laughed, and Aisha felt something inside her break a little. But she held on. Getting kicked out of another school wasn't an option. Her dad was barely making enough money as it was, and they couldn't move again. She had to put up with this, like she'd put up with everything else. The bell rang, and the crowd started to leave, but Bradley wasn't done. "Same time tomorrow," he said with a smile. "I'll be waiting for your next fashion show." When the hallway was empty, Connor came up to her. "You okay?" Aisha nodded, not wanting to talk. She wasn't okay, but she couldn't say why, without telling things she didn't want to share. Instead, she grabbed her books and went to class, feeling Connor watching her. The same thing happened for weeks. Every day brought new insults, new reasons for Bradley and his friends to pick on her. They'd knock her books out of her hands in the hallway, make loud comments about her clothes at lunch, and find ways to leave her out of group projects in class. The worst part was that the teachers didn't seem to notice, like dealing with kids being mean was too much work for them. One day, Aisha found herself in the school's rarely used storage room, trying to get coffee stains out of her shirt. Brittany had accidentally bumped into her at lunch, making her spill her drink. The dark liquid had stained her light shirt, and she couldn't afford to buy a new one. As she rubbed at the stains with paper towels, she heard someone in the hallway outside. The storage room was usually empty during lunch, which was why she'd gone there. But she wasn't the only one who knew about it. "Hey," said Connor's voice. "Are you in here?" Aisha sighed and opened the door. Connor was standing in the dark hallway, looking worried. "I saw what happened in the cafeteria. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said without thinking, then looked down at her stained shirt. "Well, mostly fine." Connor took off his sweater and gave it to her. "Here, you can wear this for the rest of the day." It was a small thing, but it meant a lot to Aisha. When was the last time someone had been so nice to her? She took the sweater, noticing that it smelled like soap and something that was just Connor, clean and warm and comforting. "Thank you," she said, putting it on. It was too big for her, but it was clean and soft, and it made her feel safe somehow. "You know," Connor said slowly, "you don't have to just take it. What they're doing to you, it's not right." Aisha looked at him, this kind guy who read old books for fun and always had something nice to say. How could she explain that she could probably beat up all three of her bullies without much effort, but that doing so would ruin everything she'd been trying to build? "It's complicated," she said finally. "It usually is," Connor said, "but that doesn't mean you have to deal with it alone." Something changed in Aisha's chest when she heard those words. For the first time in months, she felt like she wasn't totally alone. Connor saw her, really saw her, and that meant everything. But that small moment of connection only made what happened next even worse. The final straw came 3 weeks later, on a normal Friday afternoon. Aisha was walking to the gym when she heard loud voices from the parking lot. Through the window, she could see Connor arguing with Bradley near the football field. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but Connor looked angrier than she'd ever seen him. He was waving his hands, his usual calm face twisted. Bradley stood with his arms crossed, that smile on his face, while Kyle and Brittany stood beside him like guards. Aisha's blood ran cold when she realized what was happening. Connor was standing up for her, and it was going to end badly. She ran outside, her heart pounding. As she got closer, she could hear pieces of their argument. Treating her like dirt, and why, Connor was saying, because she doesn't fit in. Listen, pal, Bradley said, his voice dangerously calm. Nobody asked you to be her hero. Maybe you should stay out of it. She is my business, Connor snapped, and Aisha felt her chest tighten. And I'm tired of watching you make her life miserable. Then Bradley's face changed, becoming cold and calculating. Oh, I see. You've got a little thing for the thrift store, Queen. That's cute, really cute. Don't, Connor warned, but it was too late. Bradley had found his weak spot. What do you think, Brittany? Should we tell Connor here what we really think about his girlfriend's style? Brittany giggled, a sound like glass breaking. Oh, you mean how she looks like she gets dressed in the dark? Or how she always smells like that cheap perfume from the discount store? That's enough, Connor said, stepping forward, but Kyle was ready for him, shoving Connor back hard enough to make him stumble. Stay in your place, nerd, Kyle said, or we'll make sure you join your girlfriend at the bottom. Aisha was close enough now to see Connor's face, red with anger and something else, hurt. He was putting himself in danger for her, and she couldn't let that happen. Connor, she called out, running over. What's going on? All four of them turned to look at her, and she saw the exact moment when Bradley's cruel smile got wider. He'd found the perfect way to hurt her. Oh, perfect timing, he said. We were just talking about your fashion sense with your boyfriend here. He's not my boyfriend, Aisha said fast, but it was too late. The idea was out there now, and she could see Bradley thinking of what to do with it. Right, Brittany said, looking between them. Just friends. How sweet. Actually, Bradley said, I think we should get to know Connor better. After all, anyone who's willing to defend our little charity case here must be pretty special. The threat was clear, and Aisha felt fear rising in her. Being bullied was one thing, she could handle that. But watching Connor get hurt because of her, that was too much. Leave him alone, she said, standing in front of Connor to protect him. Your problem is with me, not him. Oh, I don't have a problem with you, Bradley said, his voice smooth. I just think you could use some style help. Right, Brittany? Before Aisha could stop her, Brittany reached out and grabbed the edge of Connor's sweater, the one Aisha was still wearing from that day in the storage room. This is cute, she said, touching the fabric. Very generous. Don't touch her, Connor said, moving around Aisha to face them. His hands were shaking a little, but his voice was firm. Or what? Kyle asked, smiling. You'll bore us with your homework. That's when everything went wrong. Connor, sweet Connor, who had never hurt anyone in his life, swung at Kyle. It was clumsy and slow, the kind of punch you see in movies, not in real fights. Kyle caught his wrist easily, twisting Connor's arm behind his back. Bad move, nerd, Kyle said, forcing Connor to his knees. Let him go, Aisha said, her voice sharp. Something in her voice made Kyle stop, but only for a second. I don't think so, Bradley said, watching her face. I think Connor here needs to learn some manners. And I think you need to learn what happens when you send your boyfriend to fight your battles. The next few seconds seemed to take forever. Brittany reached for the zipper of Connor's sweater, wanting to pull it off Aisha as a way to make her feel small. But the zipper got stuck, and in her anger, Brittany yanked hard enough to tear the fabric. The sound of the tear was loud in the afternoon air, and Aisha watched in horror as Connor's favorite sweater, the one he'd given her when she needed it most, ripped in Brittany's hands. Oops, Brittany said, not sounding sorry at all. I guess it was cheaper than I thought. Connor's face turned white. That was my grandpa's, he said softly. He gave it to me before he passed away. The parking lot went quiet. Even Bradley seemed to realize they'd gone too far. But it was too late. The damage was done. Connor's most important thing was lying in pieces on the ground, and Aisha could see the sadness in his eyes. Something inside her broke. All those months of holding back, all of Master Lee's words about staying calm and being responsible, all of her fears about starting over again, none of it mattered anymore. These people had hurt the one person who had been kind to her, and they'd done it because of her. "You're going to pay for that," Aisha said, her voice low and dangerous. Bradley laughed, but it sounded forced. "Oh, really? What are you going to do? Write us a mean letter?" Aisha didn't answer. Instead, she did something she'd never done before. She shifted her weight, just a little. Her feet moved to the right place, her weight balanced, her hands relaxed at her sides. To anyone who didn't know what to look for, she still seemed like the same quiet, defenseless girl. But there was something different now, a hidden power that seemed to come from inside her. Connor, still on his knees with Kyle holding his arm, looked up at her, confused. "Aisha, don't. It's not worth it." But it was worth it. Connor was worth it. The way he'd stood up for her, the way he'd seen her as a person instead of a target, the way he'd shared his most important thing with her, all of it was worth fighting for. "Let him go," she said again, and this time there was no question that she was in charge. Kyle just laughed and twisted Connor's arm harder, making him cry out, "Make me fashion disaster." Later, Aisha would remember this as the moment when everything changed, not just for her, but for everyone watching, because in that moment, she stopped being the quiet girl who took whatever the world gave her and became something else entirely. She moved faster than anyone expected, closing the space between herself and Kyle in 2 quick steps. Her hand shot out, not to punch, but to strike a pressure point on his wrist. Kyle's grip on Connor loosened right away, his fingers going numb. "What the heck?" Kyle started to say, but Aisha was already moving again. She grabbed his arm and used his own power against him, stepping to the side and pulling him into a throw that sent him crashing to the ground. It was perfect taekwondo, the kind of move that looked easy but took years to learn. The sound of Kyle hitting the ground was like a loud bang in the quiet parking lot. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Bradley stepped forward, his face red with anger. "You little brat," he growled, reaching for her. Aisha didn't move. Instead, she shifted her weight again into a fighting stance that Master Lee had taught her over and over. When Bradley's hand came toward her, she was ready. She caught his wrist in a grip that felt soft, then twisted and stepped, using his own power to make him stumble past her. As he tried to get his balance, she moved behind him, her arms sliding around his neck in a chokehold. "I said let him go," she whispered in Bradley's ear, her voice calm even though she was full of energy. "I meant it." Bradley tried to pull her arm away, but Aisha was in the right place. She wasn't cutting off his air completely, just enough to make him know how helpless he was. Around them, the crowd that had gathered was quiet, recording everything on their phones. "Aisha?" Connor said, sounding worried. "That's enough." She looked at him. This kind boy who had been nice to her when no one else was, and something in his eyes made her remember who she was. She wasn't like them. She wasn't mean or wanting revenge. She was better than that. Slowly, she let go of the chokehold, letting Bradley stumble away from her. He turned to face her, his face red and his breathing heavy, but the anger was gone from his eyes. Instead, there was something she'd never seen before: fear. "Stay away from him," she said, her voice clear across the parking lot. "Stay away from both of us. And if I ever see you hurting someone again, if I ever see you using your power to make someone else's life bad, I will finish what we started here today." Brittany, who had been too shocked to move, finally spoke. "You can't just attack people. I'm telling the principal." "Good," Aisha said, turning to face her. "Tell him everything. Tell him how you've been making my life a nightmare for months. Tell him how you ripped Connor's sweater for fun. Tell him how you've been using your friends to bully people weaker than you." Brittany's mouth opened and closed, but she couldn't say anything. She looked to Bradley for help, but he was still trying to catch his breath, holding his throat. Kyle had managed to stand up, his face full of anger and shame. "This isn't over," he said, starting toward her again. But Connor stepped between them, and something in his face had changed too. He wasn't the same quiet boy who had been on his knees just minutes ago. He stood taller now, his shoulders back, his eyes full of anger. "Yes, it is," he said firmly. "It's over. All of it." For a moment, the five of them stood in a circle, the air thick with tension and the weight of everything that had just happened. Then, slowly, Kyle backed down. He looked at Aisha, at the way she stood with perfect balance and calm breathing, and seemed to know that he couldn't win this fight. "Come on," he said to the others. "This isn't worth it." But Bradley didn't move. He was staring at Aisha with a mix of disbelief and something that might have been respect. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked quietly. Aisha thought about not answering, but something in his voice, the real question behind the words, made her decide to be honest. "I've been training since I was 11, she said. "Taekwondo. My mum thought it would help me feel better about myself." "Did it work?" he asked, and there was no meanness in his voice now. Aisha looked around at the crowd of students who were staring at her in a new way, at Connor, who was looking at her like she was a hero, at the three people who had made her life hard for months and were now seeing her as she really was for the first time. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think it did." The crowd started to leave, students going back to their cars or to the school building. But the feeling in the air had changed. Instead of the usual mix of fear and excitement that came with fights like this, there was something else, a sense that things had been made right, that the world was back in balance. As Bradley walked away, he stopped and turned back to her. "I'm sorry," he said, "about the sweater. About everything. It wasn't much, but it was something. An understanding that he'd gone too far, that he'd caused real pain." Aisha nodded, accepting the apology for what it was. Connor knelt down and picked up the pieces of his torn sweater, his face sad, but not angry. "It's just a piece of clothing," he said, but Aisha could hear the hurt in his voice. "No, it wasn't," she said, kneeling beside him. "It was important to you. It mattered." He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw the moment when he saw her in a new way. "You could have done that any time," he said. "You could have stopped all of this months ago." "I know. Why didn't you?" Aisha thought about how to answer that, how to explain the weight of knowing you could hurt people, the fear of becoming the kind of person you hated, the way fighting always seemed to make things worse. "Because once you do that," she said finally, "you can't go back. And I didn't want to be like them." Connor nodded slowly, understanding. "But you did it anyway. For me. You stood up for me," Aisha said. "Nobody's ever done that before." They sat there in the empty parking lot, surrounded by the pieces of his grandpa's sweater, and something passed between them that was stronger than words. It was the feeling of kindness given and received, of courage in the face of cruelty, of the moment when two people knew they weren't alone in the world. Over the next few weeks, everything changed at Crestwood Academy. The story of the quiet girl who had taken down the school's biggest bully spread like crazy, growing bigger and bigger as it was told. But the truth was more simple and more important than any story. Bradley didn't become a totally different person, but he stopped being mean. He still had his place as the big man on campus, but he used it in a new way. When he saw someone being picked on, he helped them. When his friends started to gang up on someone, he stopped them. It was like facing his own weakness had shown him the good in others. Brittany and Kyle took longer to change, but you could see it happening. Without Bradley's approval, their cruelty didn't have as much power. They still hung out with their friends, but they weren't as mean. They'd learned that their actions had results, and that made them more careful. For Aisha, the change was more complicated. She wasn't invisible anymore, which was both good and bad. Students who had never noticed her before now smiled at her in the hallways. Teachers who had never called on her now seemed happy to hear what she had to say. She'd earned respect, but she'd also lost the safety of being unknown. The hardest part was learning to trust her new reputation. For months, she'd been seen as weak, as someone who couldn't or wouldn't stand up for herself. Now, she was seen as strong, as the person who had fought back. Both ideas felt wrong, like they didn't show who she really was. But Connor helped her get used to this new life. He understood what it was like to be seen in a different way, to have to live up to one moment of bravery that had changed how people saw you. Together, they found their way in this new world. Their friendship grew into something more over the next few months. It started with eating lunch together in the library, then walking home from school, then talking for hours about books and dreams, and the strange experience of being teenagers in a world that often didn't make sense. Connor showed her that being kind wasn't the same as being weak, and Aisha showed him that being strong didn't mean being mean. The torn sweater became a symbol for them. Connor kept the pieces, not because he was sad, but to remember the day when everything changed. And Aisha, with her mom's help, learned to sew so she could put it back together. It wasn't the same. You could see the seams, and the fabric was patched, but it was whole again. Different, but whole. One evening, as they sat on the steps outside the school after a long day, Connor asked her the question she'd been waiting for. "Do you regret it? Fighting back?" Aisha thought about it carefully. She thought about the months of being made fun of, the way she'd felt invisible and worthless. She thought about the moment when she'd seen Connor on his knees, hurt because of her. She thought about the choice she'd made and all the things that had led to it. "No," she said finally. "I regret that it took me so long." Connor smiled, and it was like the sun coming out. "I'm glad you waited," he said. "If you'd done it sooner, I might not have gotten to know you first. The real you, not just the fighter everyone sees now." It was a nice thing to say, and it made Aisha realize something important. She wasn't just the quiet girl who got picked on, and she wasn't just the fighter who had stood up to the bullies. She was both of those things and more. A complicated person with good and bad sides, someone who had learned to be kind without being weak and strong without being mean. The lesson she'd learned wasn't just about fighting back, even though that was part of it. It was about knowing when to fight and when to walk away, about using your power to protect instead of to control, about the difference between justice and revenge. Master Lee had been right. The best fight was the one you didn't have to have. But sometimes, when you had no other choice, when someone you cared about was in danger, you had to be willing to step into the ring. As the sun set over Crestwood Academy, painting the sky with colors, Aisha felt calm in a way she hadn't felt in months. She wasn't the girl who let the world walk all over her, but she hadn't become the person she'd always been afraid of either. She'd found a way to be strong without being cruel, to demand respect without becoming a bully herself. The next morning, she would wake up and wear clothes that she liked, not because she was worried about what others might think. She would walk through the halls with her head held high, knowing that she had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. And if someone needed help, if someone weaker was being picked on, she would be ready. But for now, she sat with Connor on the school steps, watching the last light leave the sky, and felt thankful for the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd learned that real strength wasn't about being the toughest person in the room. It was about being the person who was willing to stand up when it mattered most. 30,584 characters.